It's a pleasure to talk with you about a very serious but important topic. I am Julian Ford. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, and I'm also a clinical psychologist, like most, if not all of you. And today we're going to be talking about the assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and complex PTSD. And we'll also touch upon some relevant treatment issues as well. Let's start with the impact of traumatic stress on the brain, because that's really what assessment is all about. We're looking at the signs and symptoms of PTSD or complex PTSD, and we're looking at behaviors, at emotional reactions, at social relationships, all of the clinical data that are crucial for us as psychologists to understand in working with our clients. But the background really is for all of us to understand what's changed when an individual, a child, or an adult, but in this case we'll focus on children, have experienced serious traumatic events in their lives, possibly single traumatic events like a motor vehicle accident or a very serious life-threatening illness or the loss of a primary caregiver, or that may be much more prolonged. And the whole question of loss is obviously one where it's not just a single event. It may go on for months, years, and the effects obviously last over potentially an entire lifetime. But there are also other traumatic experiences that are very chronic very often. For example, of course, as you all well know, when children are maltreated, when there's abuse or neglect. Also, when children are exposed to domestic violence or community violence or war or terrorism. So there's just a wide range of potentially traumatic events that can affect the development of any child, no matter how healthy they are, no matter what walk of life they come from, no matter how old they are, even though age, of course, has an impact on the symptoms of PTSD, and no matter what ethnocultural background they come from or what country in the world they live in, whether they're in an urban setting or in a rural setting. And I'm sure you've worked with children who come from many, if not all, of these different backgrounds. What we need to understand that's really universal is the impact of the shock of traumatic stress on the individual's brain and their body. And in order to do that, we need to go back to brain science. So I'm going to give you an overview. It's based upon hundreds and hundreds of studies that our colleagues have done in the neuroscience arena. And the summary will give you a sense of how we now are beginning to understand the way in which the shock of a life-threatening or a profound interruption in the sense of security and primary caregiving relationships, how those kinds of events, which is what really we're talking about when we're talking about traumatic stress, how those actually lead to adaptations in the brain that are not pathological, at least not initially. In fact, they are very survival-oriented. But they lead to changes that, if persistent, become potentially a source of a great deal of impairment. So Marty Teicher and his colleagues have done a number of studies, and they did a really wonderful comprehensive overview article in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2013. And what they found was that when children are maltreated, especially early in life, for example, toddlers or infants, that this is actually associated with those children developing a smaller area in the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is responsible for many things in the brain and in our psychological functioning, but primarily it has to do with memory, with the encoding of new memories, with the retrieval of memories that have been stored in long-term memory, and working memory as well, the ability to access memory in real time and use memory information. So what they found was that over a number of studies, children who are exposed to maltreatment potentially don't fully develop this crucial memory site in the brain. They also, another study found that there were subtle changes in children's brains when they've experienced abuse in childhood. These are not as obvious as the change in the size of a particular area of the brain, like the hippocampus, but they have to do with the thickness of the cortex, which is, of course, the area of the brain that's so crucial for many, many complex psychological processes, including executive functioning. And there are subtle changes in the folding of the brain, the ways in which the brain actually folds in and around itself. And those folds actually have a great deal to do with neurotransmission, because they provide shortcuts as well as also longer paths between different neural areas and different areas in the brain. So for the cortex to not develop as thickly, and for the gyri, or the folds of the brain, to develop in an altered fashion, can lead to fundamental changes in how the brain actually processes information. We don't know exactly how that plays out, but it's clear that there are changes that essentially, again, are adaptive for survival, but that perhaps potentially may lead to long-term difficulties with emotion processing, with information processing, and with self-management. Maltreated children also have been found to have changes in their brain that often don't manifest until late in puberty or the transition into adulthood. So these are changes that don't necessarily show up on neuroimaging studies or scans when children are still young and pre-adolescent, or even in early adolescence. They change the brain in ways that take shape over a long period of time. That doesn't mean that children are unaffected. It's just that their brains are still developing, and so some of these changes don't actually show up very clearly until early adulthood or late puberty. It's also important to remember that in childhood, every child's brain is, of course, developing, and it has a degree of immaturity that's just natural as part of the developmental process. And one area in particular that's really crucial in traumatic stress, and in stress itself more generally, is the amygdala. Now, the amygdala functions in some respects as a kind of an alert system. It's both an attention system that signals when it's important for the individual to pay attention, but it also is an alarm system that signals when there's potential danger. And in childhood, the amygdala itself is actually still forming in a way that the portions of the amygdala that make it up, which it's actually not a single entity, it's actually a series of actual sections. There's a central section that is particularly sensitive to threat. There's also a base and lateral, that is a bottom and side area called the basolateral area, that's very sensitive to potential fear. And those areas are not really well integrated or separated, both in childhood as the amygdala is developing. It's also the case that the amygdala is highly connected to the prefrontal cortex, so that's the PFC for the abbreviation. And the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain that's associated with executive functioning, with conscious thought and decision-making, problem-solving, and so forth. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are not well connected in childhood ordinarily. This is just normative. So we have an area of the brain that is designed to help us be alert and to detect threats, and that also is connected to the areas of the brain that involve our conscious thinking. And that area of the brain, the amygdala, is not fully developed in childhood, nor is it well connected to the frontal areas of the brain that actually process information consciously. So we have potentially in childhood an alarm system that is ready to go, but is not really fully developed and is not well connected to our conscious ability to actually think through what the alarm signals in our body and brain are telling us. Early life stress and PTSD have also both been shown to further disrupt the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And that specifically involves this basolateral area of the cortex that has to do with fear sensitivity. So childhood stress, traumatic or otherwise, and post-traumatic stress, when it's significant enough to be a disorder, are both related to a further disruption of the connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. We don't know for sure, but to the extent that this happens in childhood, this potentially is essentially preventing the development of the connectivity that happens normatively between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So it may not be ruining a connection that exists, it may be preventing a connection from developing, and the bottom line is it's leading the child to experience sense of fear or alarm or threat that the child is then not able to fully consciously process. Felt fear but not consciously processed fear can become a very serious problem. Resilience to early life stress and maltreatment have been found to have been associated, conversely, with strong connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. So again, the ways in which the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and their connections develop in childhood is crucial to the child and the adult subsequently being able to actually make sense of fear, anxiety, and potential threats. And it's also true that just ordinary stress, normative stress, is related to increased, but PTSD is related to reduced connection between the amygdala and the hippocampus. So here we have two areas of the brain that are actually located right next to each other, and later on I'll show you a graphic illustration that demonstrates this and that can actually be quite useful in talking with clients. The amygdala and the hippocampus are very closely interconnected anatomically, but they're not necessarily connected in terms of neural transmission. And normatively, it's expectable that the amygdala and hippocampus will develop a strong connectivity so that when there's a threat or fear signal that comes from the amygdala's reaction to stimuli from the environment, the hippocampus is very quickly and very reliably signaled to access memories that are relevant, which can then provide a basis for understanding what the threat is or what the fear is and reacting in a way that is actually commensurate with and adaptive for dealing with whatever that may be, whether it's minor or major. However, in PTSD, that connection between the alarm center and the memory center is reduced. And that means that the child or the adult has less access to memories that can help them to make sense of their feelings of fear or threat.